When I gave my grandson a heirloom watch, my daughter-in-law ripped it from his wrist and said, "You don't need trash from a man who's half dead." My son shrugged and said, "Let's just keep the peace." I nodded. But when the appraisal papers arrived the next week showing what that watch was tied to, her hands began shaking as I stood in my dim study that night, running my thumb along the empty place on my wrist where the watch chain used to rest. The skin there felt different somehow, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with weight. I had worn that chain for 41 years. My father had clasped it onto my wrist the morning I graduated from university, and I had never taken it off voluntarily since. Not once, not for surgery, not for sleep, not for anything. And now it was gone, sitting in Leora's purse like a forgotten receipt, handled by someone who saw only tarnish where I saw a lifetime. I am Elias Corvin, 78 years old, once a senior industrial engineer at one of the country's largest infrastructure firms, the kind of man who spent 30 years designing systems that held bridges together and kept power running through cities that never knew my name. I had built things meant to last. I had also built things meant to be hidden until the right moment arrived. That night, sitting in the chair I had occupied for decades, listening to the old house settle around me, I realized the right moment had finally come and that it had arrived wearing the face of my daughter-in-law's contempt. Let me take you back to the moment it started, because that moment deserves to be held up to the light and examined from every angle before I tell you what came next. The dining room at Caleb's house smelled like the expensive candles Leora bought in bulk, the kind that cost $40 each and smelled like nothing that existed in nature. I had driven 40 minutes to be there for Evan's birthday dinner. 6 years old, my grandson, with his father's dark eyes and my own habit of tilting his head sideways when something puzzled him. I had brought the watch for him to hold, not to keep permanently, just to hold and to understand. I wanted him to feel the weight of it. I wanted to tell him about his great-grandfather, about the factory floor in Ohio where the watch was purchased in 1931, about how it had survived 2 wars inside a coat pocket and 1 house fire inside a tin box buried in a backyard. Evan's face had lit up like sunrise when I clasped it around his small wrist. It was comically large on him, sliding down to his knuckles, and he had laughed at that, this pure, uncomplicated laugh that I could feel in my chest. "It's heavy, Grandpa," he said, holding his wrist up to show me, "like it's got stuff inside it." "It does," I told him, "it's got time inside it." That was when Leora's voice came down like a blade. "Don't touch my son with that old man's trash." She crossed the room in 3 steps, yanking the watch off Evan's wrist hard enough that the boy stumbled sideways. He stood there with his hand still raised, fingers slightly curled, looking at his wrist like he expected to find something wrong with it. He was 6 years old and he didn't understand what had just happened, only that something had been taken and that the adults in the room had gone very still and very quiet. "This belonged to his grandfather," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me even then. "Exactly," Leora said, holding the watch between 2 fingers like it had been found in a gutter. "He's half dead. We don't need reminders of decay around my child." Caleb was on his phone. He looked up for exactly 2 seconds. "Mom, let's just keep the peace," he said, and then he looked back down at his screen. I had known for a long time that my son had become someone I barely recognized. The Caleb I raised had been curious and stubborn and full of opinions about things. He used to argue with me about engineering principles at the dinner table when he was 14, pointing at my drawings and telling me I had the load distribution wrong. He had been wrong, but I had loved that he cared enough to argue. Somewhere between his marriage and his mortgage and his comfortable numbness, that boy had disappeared entirely, replaced by a man who chose his phone over his father's dignity without even looking up to watch it happen. The watch disappeared into Leora's purse. I stood there for a moment, feeling something move through me that I chose not to release. I had spent too many years learning when to speak and when to be silent. My father had taught me that silence was not surrender. He said that the loudest men in any room are always the most afraid. I thought of him then, holding his pocket watch in his enormous calloused hands, telling me that some things take time to reveal their full value. "Be careful what you call trash," I said quietly before Leora could turn away. She laughed, not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh, a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine contempt. She didn't even turn around to deliver it. She just walked out of the room still laughing, and the sound of it followed me all the way to the door and all the way to my car and all the way home through the dark. That night in my study I didn't rage. I'm an engineer by training and temperament. I do not rage, I measure. I look at a problem from every angle and I identify the precise point where the structure is weakest and I decide what kind of force would be most effective. Leora had handed me a gift without knowing it. She had revealed herself completely. She had also, in her arrogance, taken something she had no idea she was taking, and that was the detail that changed everything. I will be honest with you about my flaws because I think they matter to this story and because I have always believed that a man who cannot name his own weaknesses is a man who has no real understanding of himself. My flaw, the one that has caused me genuine trouble throughout my life, is that I am obsessively private. I keep things close. I keep plans inside myself for so long that the people around me are always blindsided when I finally act, and sometimes that blindsiding does more damage than I intended. My wife, God rest her, used to say that living with me was like living next to a reservoir. You never knew how much was behind the dam until it opened. She meant it affectionately, mostly, but she also meant it as a warning. The night after the watch was taken, I sat at my desk and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had accumulated over years. The time Leora had referred to my career as infrastructure stuff at a dinner party while explaining to her friends that she herself worked in brand consulting, as if the two were being compared and mine was found wanting. The time she had told Caleb in my presence that Evan didn't need to spend so much time with older influences because it was confusing for his development. The Christmas she had quietly replaced every gift I brought with newer versions because mine were, in her words, not age-appropriate, when in fact they were simply not expensive enough. I had absorbed all of it. I had kept the reservoir locked, but this was different. The watch was not just a sentimental object. And Leora, in her sweeping, careless certainty that everything connected to me was beneath consideration, had crossed a line that had legal and financial dimensions she was completely unaware of. I picked up the phone and called a man named Richard Holt. Richard had been my attorney for 31 years. He answered on the second ring even though it was late, which told me he had been expecting my call, which told me that some part of him had been watching my family situation with professional concern. "Richard," I said, "it's time." There was a pause, then he said, "I'll get the documents together." "I want it done properly," I told him. "No room for challenge, no ambiguity." "Elias," he said, and his voice had that particular quality it got when he was choosing his words carefully. "Are you sure? Once we restructure the trust, it's irrevocable. Caleb loses the inheritance pathway entirely." I thought about my son sitting on his couch with his phone while his father was humiliated 10 feet away. "I'm sure," I said. "And the watch itself, if she's holding it." "Let her hold it," I said. "Let her laugh about it. That's exactly what I need her to do." What neither Caleb nor Leora knew, what no one in my immediate family had ever been told because I had never felt the moment was right to tell them, was that the pocket watch was not simply a family heirloom. It was what an attorney would call an instrument of record. When my father purchased it in 1931, he was a young man working in a factory owned by a man named Horace Dunwell, who happened to be the founding partner of what eventually became Dunwell Industrial Holdings, a mid-sized manufacturing conglomerate that had quietly grown and merged and transformed over the following 7 decades into something considerably more substantial than its origins suggested. My father, in lieu of wages owed during a particularly bad stretch in the Depression, had accepted shares in that company plus the watch as symbols of good faith. Those shares had been recorded, transferred, and held in a private family trust that I had structured carefully in 1987 with Richard's help. The watch itself was referenced in the trust documentation as a physical marker of origin, the object that had changed hands the day my father's equity stake was formalized. It wasn't legally necessary to the trust's operation, but I had arranged things so that possession of the watch, specifically voluntary transfer of the watch by the primary trust holder, triggered a clause that I had inserted precisely for a situation like this one. The clause was simple. If the primary trust holder, meaning me, voluntarily released physical custody of the watch to another party without explicit legal documentation of intent, it was to be interpreted as a trigger for restructuring review. I had put that clause in 30 years ago as a kind of dead man's switch, a way to force an evaluation of the trust's beneficiary structure if my mental capacity was ever called into question. What it also meant, in practical terms, was that the moment Leora had taken the watch from Evan's wrist and dropped it in her purse, and the moment I had chosen not to stop her, I had technically initiated a chain of events that Richard had been waiting patiently to execute. I want to be clear, I had not planned this specific scenario. I had not engineered Leora's cruelty. I had not predicted that she would take the watch. What I had done 30 years ago was build a system with enough flexibility to be useful in multiple circumstances, which is what a good engineer always does. Leora had simply walked into a structure I had built decades before she entered my family's life, and she had pulled on a lever without knowing the lever was there. Over the following days, I moved carefully. Richard filed the restructuring paperwork, Appraisers I had used before were contacted. I also reached out to a firm that specialized in provenance documentation for significant assets because I wanted the materials that would arrive in that envelope to be completely beyond dispute, the kind of documentation that no amount of outrage or grief could challenge on factual grounds. I was meticulous. I was, if I am being honest, perhaps too absorbed in the mechanics of it all. There were moments where my obsessive privacy reasserted itself as a flaw in the machinery. I didn't tell Evan, obviously, but I also found myself reluctant to tell my older sister, who had been my confidant for decades and who would have told me correctly that I needed to speak to Caleb directly before all of this was final. I ignored the small voice in my head that sounded like her. I told myself that Caleb had made his choice in that dining room when he looked at his phone. I told myself that a man who won't defend his father doesn't deserve advance notice of the consequences. I told myself a lot of things that were partially true and therefore more dangerous than outright lies. Meanwhile, Leora was enjoying herself. I know this because Caleb called me 3 days after the dinner, not to apologize, but to casually mention that Leora had taken the watch to an antique dealer and been told it was worth perhaps $200 in its current condition. He delivered this information in the tone of someone sharing neutral facts. "She's thinking of cleaning it up and reselling it," he said. "Unless you want it back, she said she'd sell it to you for $250. I sat with that for a moment. I counted to 5, which is a habit I developed in my 40s when I realized that my first response to things was usually the wrong one. "No thank you," I said. "She should keep it." "Are you sure? I mean, I know it was sentimental." "Caleb," I said, "I'm sure." There was a pause. "Okay, well, she might list it online then." "That's her right," I said. "She took possession of it." Another pause, longer this time, as if some distant instinct in my son was trying to tell him something was wrong with this conversation. But the instinct, like everything else in Caleb, had been buried under too many years of comfortable avoidance to make itself fully heard. "Okay," he said, "just thought you should know." "I appreciate that," I said, and I ended the call. I am not a man who smiles in private at his own plans. That has never been my style. But I will say that I sat in my chair for a long moment after that call ended, feeling something very close to certainty settle over me like a well-fitted coat, and that feeling was almost pleasant. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. I had not sent it myself. Richard's office handled the delivery. Certified mail, return receipt, the whole formal apparatus. I was parked down the street in my car when the postal carrier walked up the front path and rang the bell. Not because I needed to watch it happen, but because, if I am being completely honest, some part of me that I am not entirely proud of wanted to be near the moment. My sister would say that impulse was about control, and she would be right. I am working on that. I watched Leora open the door. She signed for the envelope with her usual brisk efficiency, already moving back inside before the carrier had fully turned away. I imagined her standing in the hallway pulling out the documents, probably still wearing the small half-smile she seemed to carry as a default expression, the one that said she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever was happening. I gave it 6 minutes and then I got out of the car. I had a key to the house. Caleb had given it to me 2 years ago for emergency purposes, and he had never asked for it back, which I suspected he had simply forgotten about. I let myself in through the front door, which meant I heard Leora before I saw her. "This can't be real," she was saying. Her voice had lost all its usual smooth certainty. It had gone thin and high in a way I had never heard before. "Caleb, this cannot be real." "What is it?" Caleb's voice coming from the kitchen. "What's that?" Come here right now." I walked into the hallway and stood at the edge of the living room. Leora was standing with the documents spread across the coffee table, her hands pressed flat against them like she could hold them still or hold them in place or hold back whatever they meant. Caleb was crossing the room toward her, and Evan was in the corner with his toy cars, making quiet engine sounds to himself, completely uninvolved in whatever storm was gathering above him. Leora looked up and saw me. The color left her face in a way I had not quite anticipated. Not just embarrassment, not just surprise. Something deeper than that, something like the recognition of a fall that has already begun when your body knows before your mind does that the ground is coming up fast. "What is this?" she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "What you asked for," I said, "a proper appraisal." Caleb reached the table and looked down at the documents. I watched him read for about 15 seconds before his face changed. "Dad," he said slowly, "what is this?" "It's the provenance documentation for the watch," I said, "and the trust restructuring filing, and the appraisal which sets the current value at considerably more than $250. Leora's hands were trembling now. I could see the slight vibration in the papers beneath them. "How much?" she said. I looked at her steadily. The watch itself, as an instrument with historical and legal significance attached to the Dunwell Industrial Holdings Trust, was appraised at approximately $340,000. The room was absolutely silent, except for Evan's engine sounds in the corner. 300, Caleb started. "That's before you account for the trust assets themselves," I said, "which Richard can walk you through in detail if you'd like. I can give you his number." Leora straightened up slowly. Something was happening behind her eyes, something that looked like calculation and panic fighting each other for priority. "Take it back," she said. "Just take it back. We'll give you the watch. We'll undo all of this." "You can absolutely give me the watch back," I said. "That's not the issue." "Then what is the issue?" Caleb said. His voice had an edge I hadn't heard from him in years, something that almost sounded like the boy who used to argue with me about load distribution. "The issue," I said, "is that the trust has already been restructured. Richard filed the paperwork 4 days ago. The beneficiary change is irrevocable under the terms I established in 1987. Leora moved around the coffee table. She was close to me now, close enough that I could see the effort she was making to keep her composure, the physical work of it, jaw tight, breath controlled, hands pressed against her own thighs. "Fix it," she said. "Call Richard right now and fix it." "I can't fix it," I said. "That's what irrevocable means." "You're punishing us," Caleb said. He ran both hands through his hair and sat down heavily on the arm of the couch. "You're punishing us over a watch." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said, and I meant this with complete sincerity. "I'm giving something to its proper recipient." "He's 6 years old," Leora said. Her voice had broken open now. The smooth shell of her was just gone, and underneath it was something rawer and more frightened than I expected to find. "He's 6 years old and you're putting all of this on him?" "The trust is managed by Richard until Evan turns 30, I said. "He'll never feel the weight of it, he'll only ever feel the benefit of it." "And us," Caleb said. He looked at me directly for the first time since before any of this started. "What about us?" I looked at my son for a long moment. There was so much I could have said. I could have talked about the dining room and the phone and the 2 seconds he spent looking up before going back to his comfortable silence. I could have listed every moment over the past several years when he had chosen the path of least resistance through his father's dignity. I could have told him about the reservoir and the dam and the decades of accumulation that had finally needed somewhere to go. But I had spent 78 years learning that the most important things are usually the simplest ones, so I said what was true and left the rest. "You made your choices," I said quietly. "Every time you made your choices." Caleb flinched. It was small, but I saw it. Leora had turned away from both of us. She was standing at the window and I could see her reflection in the glass, her arms crossed over her chest, her head slightly bowed. All the status and certainty and contempt she carried like armor had simply gone somewhere, evaporated out of her, and what was left looked genuinely small. "I didn't know," she said, not to me specifically, maybe to the room, maybe to herself. I didn't know what it was. "No," I agreed, "you didn't." There was a beat of silence and then she turned around and her voice had hardened again, which I had expected because that was her defense mechanism, the only tool she knew how to reach for. "You set a trap," she said. "You deliberately let me take it so you could do this." I considered that. "I let you take it because arguing with you in front of your son seemed like the worst choice," I said. "What you did with it afterward was entirely your own decision." "That's not," she stopped, started again. You knew what would happen." "I knew what was possible," I said. "You made the specific choices that determined what actually happened." Evan had looked up from his cars by this point. He was watching the adults with that head tilt I had always loved, trying to process the emotional weather in the room. He saw me and his face changed into something simple and uncomplicated. He stood up and crossed the room and wrapped both arms around my leg, the way he had done since he was barely walking, and I felt the weight of him against me like the most solid thing in the world. I looked down at him. "Hey buddy," I said. "Hi Grandpa," he said into my knee. "Are you staying for dinner?" I almost laughed. I felt the laugh start somewhere deep in my chest and I let just a little of it out, quiet and private, just a small release of something that had been held in tight for a very long time. "Not tonight," I said, "but soon." "Can I see the watch?" he said, looking up at me with those dark eyes. Leora made a sound, not a word, just a sound. It's being kept safe, I told him. When you're older, I'll tell you everything about it. Does it have time inside it? He said. More than ever, I told him. I looked up then past Evan's head at Caleb. My son was staring at the floor. His shoulders were bent in a way that reminded me of the way a structure looks when its load-bearing elements have given way, not collapsed, not broken, just deformed under weight it wasn't properly designed to carry. I felt something for him in that moment that I had been struggling to feel clearly for years, which was simply grief, not anger, not contempt. Just the quiet grief of watching someone you love diminish themselves through thousands of small surrenders until you can barely see who they used to be. Caleb, I said. He looked up. Richard's number is in the envelope, I said. You should call him. The trust has provisions for your and Leora's reasonable support needs in specific circumstances. It's not a closed door entirely. It's just not the door you expected. He nodded slowly. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully read. I'm sorry, Dad, he said. The words came out raw, like they had been sitting in his throat for a long time waiting for a container to put them in. I should have said something. In the dining room, I should have. Yes, I said simply, you should have. He nodded again. He didn't argue with that, didn't deflect or qualify it, which was the most honest thing I had seen from him in years. It was a small thing, but I was an engineer. I knew how much weight a small thing could carry when it was properly placed. I looked at Leora one last time before I left. She had sat down in the armchair by the window, the documents still spread on the coffee table in front of her, and she looked at them with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't fury and it wasn't grief, and it wasn't the cold calculation she usually employed. It was something closer to reckoning, the kind of look a person gets when they have been asked a question about themselves that they don't yet know how to answer. She didn't say anything to me as I left. I didn't say anything to her. The conversation was finished in every way that mattered. I drove home in the early evening, watching the light change over the fields on either side of the highway, that particular October light that is warm and a little melancholy at the same time, gold with an edge of blue at the horizon. My wrist still felt light without the chain. I supposed it would feel that way for a while. Some absences are physical like that. They inhabit the space where something used to be and remind you of it constantly until you decide whether to fill that space with something new or to simply let it remain open as a kind of record. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Richard handled the administrative formalities without drama. Leora and Caleb retained their own attorney, which was their right, and that attorney quickly confirmed what Richard had already told them. The restructuring was sound, the clause was valid, and the documentation was airtight. There was no pathway to reversal. They absorbed that information in their own time and in their own way, which I was not present for and didn't need to be. What I did hear, through Evan's occasional phone calls, was that things at home were different, quieter. Leora had started working more, which I gathered from the way Evan mentioned casually that she was on the phone a lot, and that they had a new after-school person whose name was Daria and who made very good grilled cheese. Caleb had apparently taken up running, which Evan found hilarious for reasons he couldn't fully articulate but which made him laugh every time he mentioned it. These were small details, the kind you pick up at the edges of a 6-year-old's narration of his life, and I held each one carefully without reading too much into any of them. 3 months after the envelope arrived, Caleb came to see me alone. He drove out on a Saturday morning and sat at my kitchen table with his hands around a coffee mug, and told me that he had started seeing a therapist, which he said with the careful neutrality of a man practicing saying something out loud that he had never said out loud before. He said he was trying to understand why he had spent so long choosing comfort over everything else. He didn't ask me to validate or respond to that, which was good because I wasn't sure I had the right words ready. I just sat across from him and let him talk, which is something I had not done enough of in recent years and which felt overdue in a way that was both painful and necessary. I keep thinking about what you said, he told me, that I made my choices every time. It's true, I said. I know, he turned the coffee mug in his hands. I think I knew it when you said it. That's why it hit the way it did. He looked up at me. I want to do better. I don't know exactly how yet, but I want to. I looked at my son, this man who was 50 years younger than my father's watch and somehow still so much a work in progress, and I felt the grief shift slightly inside me. Not resolve, not disappear, but move toward something that had a little more air in it. That's enough to start, I said. He nodded. We sat in my kitchen for another hour, talking about nothing in particular, the weather and Evan's recent fascination with how cars worked, and a documentary I had watched about bridge construction that I thought he might find interesting. It was not a healed relationship. It was the first few steps of something that would take a long time and involve a great deal of patience on both sides. But it was honest, and in my experience honesty is the only foundation worth building on. As for Leora, I will tell you what is true without embellishment. She did not come to see me. She did not call. She sent a brief, formal note through Richard's office about 2 months after everything settled, stating that she wished to clarify her understanding of the trust provisions regarding Evan's future educational benefits. It was phrased with the careful dryness of someone who had been coached by an attorney, every word measured, nothing personal, nothing that acknowledged the human story underneath the legal framework. I had Richard respond in kind, also formally, also dry. I did not expect more from her than that, not yet. People who have been built by status anxiety and the need to control take a very long time to change course, if they change course at all, and I was not willing to pretend otherwise to make myself feel better about my own actions. Because I should be honest about that too. My obsessive privacy, the tendency I have to hold everything inside the reservoir until the time I decide is right, caused real damage in this situation. Caleb did not know the watch's significance because I had never told him. I had told myself this was caution, strategic thinking, protecting the asset until the right moment. But if I am fully honest, it was also partly about control and partly about a kind of private pride in being the only person who held all the information. A less closed-off version of me might have sat Caleb down years ago and explained the trust in the watch and what they meant, and that transparency might have created a different kind of relationship between us, one where Caleb felt included rather than managed. I cannot know for certain, but I sit with that possibility. The watch came back to me by courier 3 weeks after the envelope was delivered. Leora had not listed it online. She had not sold it or cleaned it or done anything with it at all as far as I could tell. It came back wrapped in a cloth inside a small box with no note. I unwrapped it in my study and held it in both hands for a long time, feeling its weight, the specific density of something that had been carried through a century of history and loss and survival. My father's hands had held this. His father's employer's hands had held this before that. I had held it for 4 decades without setting it down, and now it had been briefly somewhere else and come back, which in a way was its own kind of story. I had the clasp repaired where Leora's rough handling had slightly bent it, and then I put it back in the glass case in my study where it will remain until Evan is old enough to understand what he is holding. I have already started writing down what I plan to tell him, the full story from 1931 to now, because I am an engineer and I believe in documentation, and because some things deserve to be recorded properly so that they are not misread or lost or thrown in a purse by someone who couldn't imagine the size of what they were touching. I will not tell you that the story ended with everything repaired and everyone changed and the world made simple and satisfying. Life is not a system with clean tolerances and predictable load behavior. What I will tell you is that Evan called me on a Wednesday evening in November and asked if I had any pictures of great-great-grandpa, the one the watch belonged to, because he wanted to draw him for a school project about families. I found the pictures and sent them to Caleb's phone. 2 days later, Evan sent me a drawing in an envelope, a child's drawing with crayon and marker, a tall man with enormous hands holding something round and gold, with the words written carefully below in a 6-year-old's uneven letters. This is my family's watch. My grandpa says it has time inside it. I put it in the glass case next to the watch. That is where both of them belong, and that, I think, is the only ending worth having.